Our industry research shows that 80% or more of AI projects fail to reach meaningful production deployment and development, delivering measurable business value. This is highlighting the operational and organizational challenges in scaling beyond prototype. My name is Paul Nashawaty. I'm a practice lead and principal analyst for the AppDev practice, and I'm joined by John. John, how are you doing today? You're from ReflexAI, correct?
Doing well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, John, tell me a little bit about yourself and about ReflexAI.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. I am John Callery. I am the co-founder and chief product and technology officer at ReflexAI. And we build AI-powered simulations and quality assurance software that improve human performance in complex conversations. And the company grew out of work my co-founder, Sam Dorison, and I did when we were both leaders at the Trevor Project. And there we built, AI-powered conversation simulations to train crisis counselors at scale. And that work ended up getting major recognition, including Time's 100 Best Inventions of 2021. And one through line from that experience is, AI can accelerate experimentation dramatically, but the systems you rely on in the real world still require strong, engineering discipline and operational rigor. And I think that's really the lens that I bring to this conversation about vibe coding and scaling AI in enterprises.
Well, John, it's super relevant. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. We see a lot of organizations moving from vibe coding and AI experimentation really to production to scale deployment. But this is a challenge that, no longer can just model access. It really requires operational discipline, because when we're looking at things like governance, compliance, regulations, and control, enterprises really must have an established new engineering standard that manage AI native tech debt, ensure governance, but also prevent uncontrolled, complexity really from compounding across code, data, and automation layers. And, this is really kind of an extension of what we were seeing with shadow IT and shadow, development. But this is now becoming shadow code and application development. But, at the same time, we're seeing innovation can no longer be confined to these technical teams, because they just don't have the amount of resources in order to do it for professional developers. So we have to let citizen developers and product and operations and finance and go-to-market functions really help, build products of their own. So John, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, it really is a kind of an area that's expanding from the professional developer to the citizen developer.
Yeah, I think democratizing AI is essential. And because a lot of the best AI opportunities come from non-technical teams. So, if you think product, design, operations, and go-to-market, those are folks who are often closest to real workflow problems. And, the risk is exactly what you said. If, people are, experimenting independently, you can get kind of fragmentation and inconsistent standards in shadow AI. But, the solution isn't to stop, experimentation. The solution is to, make experimentation safe and structured. So, one of the reasons I feel really strongly about this is, we're living it right now. This week, we intentionally changed how we work. So every role in the company builds, real AI fluency as part of their daily workflow, not just as a side hobby. So, and the point of this is to remove bottlenecks. If only engineers can use AI effectively, then product context, customer nuance, and operational insight don't make it into the system. You end up with output that's fast but lacks user-centered soul that it actually needs to succeed. So practically speaking, the organizations that do this well provide shared platforms, clear policies and support, and they also create a culture where people can share what worked and what didn't without fear. And I just want to be clear, this is not about replacing people. It's about giving people leverage, and raising the bar of quality across the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there is this misnomer of AI is going to come in and take my job. And that's really, I don't think that's really the case. I mean, it's an operational tool, right? It's just because you can do math on pen and paper, but you can use a calculator. It's kind of a similar approach here. But let's talk about something you talked about, which is bridging the vibe coding, to production reality, right? The gap isn't about model quality. It's about operational rigor, right? When we look at security, observability, versioning, governance, it really comes down to prototype success, often masked with missing fundamentals. Like you think things like data quality or latency constraints or cost controls or compliance, those are things that organizations must understand and know. And then when you have AI system that's have probabilistic kind of production environments, that really it really demands guardrails, right? Because if you don't have those guardrails in place, then it's the kind of a little bit of chaos. And I get it that when you kind of want to use the words of former Andy Grove, right, from Intel, that said like let chaos and then rein it in. I guess in the context of moving production requires evaluation frameworks. It requires clear ownership. It also requires production grade data pipelines. So, John, when I'm looking at this, we're seeing a lot of vibe coding and AI experimentation, right? But what fundamentally breaks when organizations try to move these prototypes into production?
So vibe coding is incredibly powerful for exploration, right? You can iterate with an LLM quickly. You can test ideas and get to early signal way faster than traditional development. The problem is that prototypes hide operational complexity. So a demo can look great while skipping all of the fundamentals that only surface later. So once you go to production, the requirements completely change. Now you need reliable data flows, like you said, automated testing, observability, and security controls, and really clear ownership over how the system actually behaves. And so, like you mentioned, another piece is that the AI systems are probabilistic. So traditional software is mostly deterministic, but AI behavior can shift based on, everything from context to model changes to just subtle differences in input. So production environments really need those guardrails and evaluation, and it's more than just a working demo. So I think even here at ReflexAI, we've seen this firsthand in high stakes environments when, the work also affects real human outcomes. You can't just rely on something that merely seems to work. You really need evaluation frameworks and monitoring and disciplined release practices. And, there's also a hype dynamic right now where, people are talking about shipping features at incredible speed. Even the frontier, AI labs, talk about the tools that they've built and shipped in weeks. But if you've actually looked, if you've actually used a lot of these AI apps or, looked at their status pages over time, it's a reminder that operating AI systems reliably is still very hard. So if the companies who are building the models themselves, are constantly running into stability and performance of even their own apps, it means that it just shows you how big the gap really is between rapid prototyping and dependable production systems. So the takeaway isn't like, don't move fast. It's systematize velocity and, move fast with those guardrails so speed compounds instead of, creating a lot of fragility in the system.
Yeah, there's no doubt. And I think that the other thing to kind of think about here, John, is to manage the AI native technical debt, right? You mentioned shadow AI, I said shadow IT, but I think when we look at prompts sprawl and agent sprawl, that's really the new kind of sprawl that we're seeing in the shadow world, right, of AI or IT. But model upgrades, can silently break workflows like you were talking about, right? It hides the complexity, and versioning discipline is now critical, right? But this, AI really can introduce data debt, context debt, alignment debt, and emerging best practices are really kind of implementing things like AI governance layers and model registries and prompt lifecycle management, as well as AI observability stacks. So the question really isn't, can we build it? It's, can we sustain it at the end of the day? So like when I look at that, AI native technical debt is becoming a real issue, right? It really is, because there's a lot of development out there. But how is it different from traditional software debt? And what is new about engineering standards that help, that really emerge to manage this debt that's coming online?
So traditional technical debt usually comes from, messy code, shortcuts in architecture, or missing tests. And it's painful, but it's familiar territory for the industry. AI creates, new categories of debt that are a lot less visible. So like you mentioned, you get prompt sprawl, agent sprawl, inconsistent context handling, and systems that quietly break when the model or prompt changes. And so at the core difference here is the failure mode. Because traditional software tends to fail deterministically, you can reproduce the bug. AI systems are probabilistic. So, that same workflow can behave differently depending on the context, on data drift, or, how the model's behavior shifts over time. And, what this means is that you really need to bring new standards. Versioning can't just apply to code anymore. It has to also cover prompts, the model's evaluation suites, and the data context that drives behavior. And you also need continuous evaluation. So the question isn't, did it work once? It's, is it still working across scenarios at scale and under real conditions? And I think the organizations that handle this well treat AI features like real products with lifecycle management, right? It's not just one-off experiments that are stitched together into a fragile foundation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But I also want to kind of go back to something that you said earlier, democratizing, right? You talk about democratizing the AI deployments of vibe coding and such. I want to call it democratizing innovation, but really democratizing innovation without losing control, right? And looking at it in the context of non-technical teams, they're really closest to their own business problems. That's where, AI opportunity often lives, because they're trying to solve a problem. But the risk is decentralizing experimentation without guardrails causes, obviously they can go off the rails real quick, right? So what we see in best practices, we see winning organizations really are creating safe sandboxes, internal AI platforms, curated model access, and clear usage policies, right? Those are the ways to kind of put those guardrails in place. But AI literacy is becoming a competitive advantage, not just a developer skill. And the shift from citizen developer to citizen AI operator is really a model that's happening. I'm seeing that, in a lot of organizations of looking at it. So, John, when we look at democratizing AI innovation, it sounds powerful, but how do you really bring non-technical teams into the fold without creating chaos or shadow AI?
Yeah, so, like I mentioned, we're kind of going through this internally. And what we did was we started with practical, hands-on training that is focused on prompt fundamentals and workflow patterns. And then, immediately moved to applied AI work where teams, beyond engineering, are producing real deliverables on real tasks. And, we also set principles to keep that safe. So, those principles include, individuals own the output, review of the output is non-negotiable. We share learnings openly, like in a shared Slack channel or in team meetings, and then iterate on that over time rather than waiting for perfection. And so that's how we've tackled that internally, especially as we've wanted to, upskill the entire organization on AI and make it a useful tool in everybody's workflows beyond, engineering. And I think if we ask ourselves, why do engineers seem ahead of everyone else? I think engineers are starting ahead because, code is structured and the feedback loop is immediate. So you write something, you run it, and then you see what happens. But the next wave is cross-functional. The biggest unlock happens when domain experts can express workflows clearly and consistently, and AI becomes that daily overlap across every role in the organization.
Yeah, no, I really like where this conversation is going, because it really kind of drives the point home of culture, bottoms up versus a top down AI strategy, right? When you're looking at culture.
Yeah.
So bottoms up really drives that innovation and speed. Like you were talking about, tops down really ensures risk management and alignment. But when you look at it, too much of a bottom-up approach can potentially equal fragmentation. And too much of a top-down approach is bureaucracy and stalled adoption, right? If we kind of call it what it is. But I think the emerging model into where you're going with this is centralized AI platform strategy and decentralized use case innovation is really key. But I also think, and you kind of nailed this in my opinion, is executive sponsorship is critical, but so is grassroots momentum. So you need to kind of have that balance between the two, right? And when we look at it, there's often tension between, the bottom-up experimentation and the top-down mandates. So John, what's the right balance to scale AI responsibility really while maintaining that velocity? It's kind of on both sides, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this tension shows up everywhere right now. So, bottoms up experimentation, creates speed and creativity. And that's where, the surprising use cases are coming from. But, too much bottom up leads to fragmentation. So, different tools, different standards, duplicated work, and risk exposure, you potentially don't even know about. So on the flip side, top-down leadership is necessary for alignment and risk management, but mandates don't really work either. So, a target like increase usage of AI by 20% is a metric, it's not a strategy. And so, the best pattern we've found is a hybrid model. Centralize the infrastructure and the guardrails, but decentralize use case discovery. And, that's also what we're doing internally as well. So, leadership sets the direction, the principles, and the safety boundaries. And then, teams experiment out loud within those constraints to share what works. So I think when you get that balance right, you don't kill velocity. It's, again, kind of going for that velocity compounded. And when I think about, what should executives actually do, I think it's, fund and prioritize shared infrastructure, define governance, and align the teams around the right outcomes. But, don't expect the best use cases to emerge. Actually, rather, expect, the best use cases to emerge, from the people who are closest to the work and not from the top. And I think you can also avoid stifling innovation by, making the rules about safety and quality and not about controlling ideas. And so, you want people to try things freely inside of a sandbox, as you mentioned, where failure is really safe and also those learnings get shared.
Yeah, for sure. But it also comes down to organizational readiness and orchestration, right? I mean, when we look at this, the high success of AI successes, it increasingly is about cross-functional orchestration, right? Whether you have engineering, security, legal, product, and finance, they're all working together, and that's a big factor. But if you have an AI, change in cost model, which you have variable inference costs versus fixed infrastructure, you have procurement and government processes that they have to evolve. And then there's also measurement for success, right? Because it's from, that deployment that we're talking about, right? And this is something that is really near and dear to my heart when it comes to like the SDLC and across the delivery, is you have to look at things like productivity gains and cycle time reduction and revenue influence and risk reduction. Those are the areas that I think are really going to help measure the balance and to your point there, but I guess I would ask this question here is like today, if you were advising a board, of leading indicators that really would help drive or tell whether an organization is truly optimized or operationalized in AI, what would you say is like the optimized and operationalized AI versus just experimenting with it? Like, what would you say that to the board and like in from those measurement perspective? Because I think that's important for the audience to understand.
Yeah, I think that the biggest trap is mistaking pilots for progress. It's really easy to create impressive demos, and that doesn't mean that the organization is generating real value. So I think the clearest leading indicator is whether AI is actually embedded into real workflows. And, are teams using it to produce real outputs every week? And are those outputs improving speed, quality, or decision-making? And another indicator is measurement. So, mature organizations track things like you mentioned, productivity gains, cycle time reduction, risk reduction, and it's not just the number of AI projects. And I think like a third is, governance maturity. Are there evaluation pipelines? Is there monitoring? Is there version discipline? And, is there clear ownership in the organization? And then I think there are real business outcomes. So in the training context, for example, like our customers, we've seen things like faster onboarding, higher confidence, and measurable improvements in communication skills, when the AI is genuinely embedded in, how teams learn and improve. So I think boards should be asking themselves 3 questions. Where is AI creating measurable value? How are we managing the risk? And, do we have AI native engineering standards that make it sustainable? And so if I had to pick, I think one leading indicator, it's, workflow penetration. If AI is showing up naturally in the cadence of work and people are sharing repeatable patterns, it's real. If it's only demos and isolated pilots, it's not.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I think there's a lot that we talked about during this, presentation, a lot for the audience to think about. It's new to a lot of organizations, but it's also something that they need to be aware of. It's a competitive advantage, and those organizations that don't take advantage of it are going to be kind of left behind, honestly. But John, thanks for being on. What would you leave with the audience on where they can learn more about what we're talking about today?
One thing I just want to add is, one thing that we've learned across industries is that as automation takes on routine work, the conversations and decisions that reach humans get more complex, more nuanced, and even more higher stakes. And so the opportunity isn't only, where can AI replace people? The real opportunity is, how do we make humans dramatically better at the moments that matter the most? And to do that responsibly, you need both sides. You need rapid experimentation and strong, operational discipline. So the systems, you build are actually trustworthy at scale. So, I think one other item is, if you, like to learn more about ReflexAI, really encourage you to, go to reflexai.com and feel free to reach out. We'd love to chat with you.
John, thanks for being on today. It's really an interesting conversation, really a lot for the audience to think about, regardless where they are in their journey. It's definitely something for them to consider. And a big thank you to all of you who've tuned in. We really do appreciate you being part of the AppDevANGLE community. But for now, that wraps up this episode. But we'll be back next Wednesday with another conversation diving into the tools, trends, and talents shaping the future of application development. So whether you're deploying at the edge, building with AI, or modernizing your cloud stack, we've got you covered. Be sure to follow us on social if you have any thoughts, questions, or just want to connect. Until next time, stay curious and stay building.